All right, thank you all for coming in once again. Hopefully in the next hour or so we can get the unemployment down to 2% and get a lot of new companies lined up at the border, and if not have the streets paved with gold, at least get the potholes formed. So let me just start by asking each of you briefly, and we'll delve into more detail later, and you can go where you want. We'll just go left to right to make it easy. If you could choose one thing to do in the year 2013 to help improve the Rhode Island economy, what would it be? Start with you, Mr. Speaker.
One thing I would do to improve the economy. The one thing, I went to all of the public occurrences. I'll be serious because I could be tongue-in-cheek. But workforce development is one thing. Preparedness for jobs, and something that I know that me and Teresa have been talking about for a long time, but it always seems to be, how do we do it better? And how do we give Rhode Islanders the right skills? When I went to the public occurrences, it seemed like, and especially listening from the employers, there seemed to be a disconnect in terms of how we have jobs available, but we don't have the right people to fill those jobs. And that was interesting because we look at it, obviously it's workforce development, you look at it from the needs of the workers. And by the way, we spend a lot of money in it, just not a lot of general revenue money, but I think it's about 50 million, 56 money so-called in workforce development. I think, how do you better coordinate it? How do you better make sure you have a connection between what is relevant, and especially, again, going back to the public occurrences sessions, hearing employers say, I have jobs available, but I'm not being able to connect the right people with the right skill sets to fit those jobs. So it's got to be, how do we make sure the money's being very well spent, and how do you assure that connectivity? And I think that would be one thing I'd like to see investigated and changed.
Okay, thank you.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention workforce development, as that has been the Senate's priority, and there are some specific pieces of legislation that I believe we can enact, and some steps that the executive branch can take to enhance jobs matching between those prospective employers and employees. However, I'd like to add to that and state that I believe that a vision for Rhode Island's economic future is perhaps the single most important thing that we need as a state. We have been lacking in a clear vision which sets forth our goals. To that end, we are working to look and examine the factors that will improve our economy in the Senate, and I know we'll be talking more about those factors, but if I were to say the number one thing would be workforce development, but close there in ranking and perhaps broader and overreaching would be consensus vision, similar to what we see in our neighboring state of Massachusetts, where every 4 years, consistent with the gubernatorial election, there is a written economic vision set forth.
Okay. Governor?
Business community tells me what they want to see more than anything is certainty and stability and predictability. So if there were one thing I'd like to accomplish, is providing that certainty to businesses. When they come here, they can look out 5, 10, 15 years, 20 years down the road and say, this is where I want to invest. This is where I want to grow my company, whether it's an outsider coming to Rhode Island or an existing business making an important decision on whether to invest here in Rhode Island and grow here in Rhode Island, such as Torrey. And they have options to expand their business around the country, around the world. And if they can look out in Rhode Island and say, I see a good future here in Rhode Island, that certainty, that predictability, that stability, they are going to invest here and grow here.
Obviously a long-term as well as a short-term goal. What, in the short term, what one thing would you do in 2013 to get that?
Really, it's hard to put it on one thing. Certainly workforce development is important, but really, the statistics show if you invest in education and infrastructure as well as workforce development, you are going to grow the economy. Mm-hmm. And you want to put it on one thing, but I can boil it down to 3. Invest in education, invest in education, invest in infrastructure, invest in infrastructure, invest in workforce development, invest in workforce development, and it will pay off. Okay. The facts support that.
And I think we all agree with that there's no single magic solution.
And I would just up to, and I think what Teresa's point was in terms of an overall vision plan. I would look at that broadly, and I think that's and concur, and I think with the governor as well, because part of that 4-year plan, I would hope, when you have the stakeholders there, we'll be looking at not only what sectors do you want to be in, but how do you have a predictable and a great tax structure? How do you go about making sure education? So part of a plan has to be a broad thinking. And so I would add to workforce development, I would concur with both the governor and Teresa in terms of, especially Teresa in terms of talking about a vision, a plan, because I think as Massachusetts, look at Massachusetts is ranked so high in so many economic factors. All we have to do is look north and say, okay, what are they doing well? What are they not doing so well? And one of the things we've seen and one of the things we've heard is they develop a plan, a 4-year plan triggered by administrations that's reviewed, and everything done is through the prism. Does it go with the plan? Does it not fit within the plan? Which then will, I think, lead to consistency and predictability because you are adjusting according to that plan set forth, again, with all the key stakeholders. Business, labor, academia, elected officials at the table. Because remember, it's not just about government solving all these problems. It's about listening to the business community and finding out what their needs are. And as Teresa again said, in terms of looking at those ranking factors, which drive me nuts, to delve into them is like, what does business friendliness really mean? And what are the factors these rating agencies look at this, so that part of this is confidence. So that people, when they see Rhode Island is bad, Rhode Island is bad, Rhode Island is bad, people stop believing that. And that's the message you send out. So maybe if we looked at some of those rankings and figure out what's making us look so bad and shine them up a little bit, we won't have the Eeyore effect so much.
The Eeyore effect?
The Eeyore effect. Everything is bad. I go back to childhood things a lot.
Everything is bad.
Well, I guess that raises the question, how bad are things? I mean, we've all seen the numbers. We're all at the bottom.
But see, that's the thing. What the Senate has undertaken is a study that RIPAC is asked to join in, which reflects the things that the speaker is talking about. What are the factors that an MSNBC or these various agencies consider when they're doing these rankings? And what are we doing well, which goes to the ER factor, and what are we not doing well? What can we do better to reach the governor's point on infrastructure to raise us in these rankings? So, for example, when you look at some of those things, fiber optic, we get great ratings and we do really well. That's where the marketing piece, what we do well. Because we're small, because we're a city-state, that's one of the things we do well. But then you look at another factor, such as the corporate tax. We're at 9%. We're the highest in New England. 1% on the corporate tax is $11 to $12 million. What can we do to do better? Well, if we look to our neighbors to the north and to the south, to Connecticut and Massachusetts, what we find is they're at I believe 8.25. I would have to look to the example, but they're approximately 1% to 1.5% lower than us.
Yeah.
Yet that significantly, when you look at the ratings, changes them in the ratings. So that's something where we can really focus on. And one of the issues that, since I've been majority leader, I think that I've worked on, or even before then, has been the tax expenditure report. And what we found recently, despite efforts in the past to facilitate communication between the Department of Labor and Training and the Division of Taxation, those efforts have not been successful.
Right.
So we need to take the report and improve that communication. So we can look at these specific tax benefits that we give. For example, the tax investment credit. There's a number of them. Mm-hmm. Are they producing jobs? Are they valuable? Or would we be better going back to these national rankings, moving down our corporate tax rate, and in fact improving our image as a state? So I really believe that we can move the needle on those ratings if we simply take those factors one at a time: infrastructure, fiber optic, education, graduation rates, one at a time as the reports do, and focus on improving in those areas that will move us up in those rankings.
What does it say about the legislature that over the years it has passed these various tax incentive programs without an effective way to measure whether we're getting the bang for our buck?
To be honest, we thought we had. We put into legislation this report. I actually was a sponsor of this legislation for the tax expenditure report. We've run into bureaucratic hurdles with regard to information sharing. Was
this an unforeseen obstacle when you passed the
It
law?
was. And at this point, the only thing I can say is that not sure if it can be done administratively, but Department of Labor and Training should be able to share information with the Division of Taxation and vice versa, as long as the confidentiality of identification provisions are in place that are binding to the Division of
But
Taxation.
that notwithstanding, that was passed because the legislature decided it wanted to get a handle on the benefits of these tax incentives. But these incentives had been getting doled out years previously without that measuring stick. Why?
Well, I can
Go
jump
ahead.
in on it because at the beginning, you almost end up back to our point about having a vision and a plan. Because you look at because you end up doing ad hoc and what you think's adding value. And quite frankly, a lot of these tax expenditures, for Fidelity, for instance, which brought a company in here which is thriving, brought a financial sector, and is doing very well. And our unemployment numbers would be even higher if we didn't have those well-paying jobs. So, I mean, what we've done over the years, and I've been part of the legislature, we've looked at these, and again, all the administrations that have proposed them, the businesses that have come in and advocated for them, we believe we've adding value. But the one thing that we've been remiss at is looking back to say, is that value the best bang for the buck? And that gets, and I'm trying to, the Senate's better at this, the House needs to catch up in terms of doing more oversight, in terms of looking at expenditures, because as we hit from 2008 going forward, and every dollar became that much more valuable because the revenues were so far off, it starts you to think about, is there a better way to do it? And I think that's a healthy process. I think going forward, I don't want to look back and say, well, why did you do this? I think going forward saying this is something we need to do, because I think just like having a plan and looking everything through the prism of the plan, I think that's healthy, because priorities change, needs change, and you have to adjust accordingly. We have a program that may be viable 10 years ago that's still in effect because the laws have changed. It may not be as viable, and that's not saying it's a bad program or a bad program at the time. It's, is there a better way to do it?
And there's some
I'd like
of
to
these
jump in here,
programs.
Teresa, 'cause
Oh, okay.
the original question was about the rankings and why are we so low. And I think there is a role for the media to play here when those rankings come out, to ask provocative questions about how they compiled those rankings. Because I believe the facts are that on sales tax and income tax, once you sift through all the exemptions, Rhode Island's about in the middle of the pack nationally. And that's here's the report from Paul Dion, our director or in our Department of Revenue, that collaborates that.
I'm sorry, in the middle of the pack on what code?
Nationally, income tax and sales tax, once you sift through our exemptions, which some of these rating agencies don't do, they just look at 7% sales tax and say, oh, you're high, you're bad. They don't look at exemptions on food and over-the-counter drugs and lower-cost clothing and other items. And here it is, we're 26 on burden of state taxation borne by businesses. We're 26, right in the middle of the pack. Where we're bad or low is on local taxation, property taxes. That's what we have to work on. And that's what I've said over and over again. Let's address the cities and towns, and that'll help this one ranking at least get better. Here we're 41st on property tax burden on businesses. We're in the middle of the pack on state taxes borne by business. These are the facts. So it's the job of the media, I think, also, before you print some of this bad news, to kind of sift through it, ask provocative questions. Well, how did you rank this? And hopefully we can do better on what the speaker calls the ER effect. It does hurt our image, and that is all relative to growing our economy here.
To speak one other issue to the factors, one area where we have really stepped forward is the area of regulatory reform. The General Assembly created the Office of Regulatory Reform in 2010. We then have moved forward with statewide permitting pilot program last year, and the governor's office, his new Office of Budget, is taking very strong steps to implement now those steps.
Better use of technology to streamline.
It's really, but we didn't get here overnight, so it's going to take a little time. So one area where on those factors I know we've really tried to meet head on has been that Office of Regulatory Reform. And to go to the governor's point, the cities and towns are part of that problem, hence why we have the voluntary program of statewide permitting, and EDC had reached out to have a liaison come from every city and town to the Office of Regulatory Reform to work with them, because it's not going to do any good if you all of a sudden have changes at the statewide level, and then somebody's stuck in front of a zoning board. And the third piece of that regulatory reform puzzle was almost inevitable after the station fire, and that was fire code. And last year we took the step of changing the date on the fire code from 2003 to a more current fire code, and then deferring to the Fire Code Board of Appeals for implementation and adaptation, which I really think is going to make a very significant difference in the area of regulatory reform. And I think that was a very natural legislative reaction to the tragedy that occurred. But as with anything, I think that it did definitely impact as we became known as the state with the most difficult and most challenging fire code in the state, in the country.
Right. In fact, the Office of Regulatory Reform, I know there's a report that's going to come out very soon. I believe they've identified probably 200 plus regulations that may be out of date, need updating, or maybe just need repeal. So that's a process. Again, it takes time. You want to act with due haste, but not so speedily that you end up getting rid of regulations that are good regulations. But it's, again, that process of we constantly need to update, review, and extrapolate new ideas and put them onto where our regulatory process is going. So I think there's some healthy signs coming out as well.
Well, let's talk about this Eeyore effect, that if perception becomes reality. But I don't think any of you would suggest that it's just perception is making reality, and the underlying reality is that Rhode Island is in good health. And I know, Governor, you've said that the state doesn't get enough credit for progress made. You pointed to the economic indicators that came out in October,
Yes.
the best since 2006 on unemployment.
Yes.
Still very sluggish. I guess
Yes.
the recent fall economic outlook conference at Bryant for New England said that Rhode Island's 10.5% unemployment rate may not get under 7% until 2016. So I guess the question I would ask briefly of all three of you, is the Rhode Island economy heading in the right direction?
Oh, absolutely. And those indicators are real. First time, only 5 the areas the federal government tracks are positive since August of 2006.
Okay.
And yes, our unemployment is unacceptably high at 10.4%, but it's going in the right direction for the last 7 months. So the hard work we're doing, laying the foundation, since it's football season, we'll use football metaphors. We're not doing the Hail Marys and the Statue of Liberty plays. We're grinding it out, investing the right way, building the economy the right way with education. It's not just talk. Together, we've put in $73 million into K-12 in the last 2 years, accelerating the school funding formula. We've reversed the cuts to higher ed, the $38 million in cuts to higher ed before I took office in 3 years. I mean, that makes no sense to me, driving up tuitions at RIC, CCRI, and URI. We've reversed that, put money back in. That's not just talking about it, that's walking the walk. And then in infrastructure, finally, for the first time I can remember going to vote, this November, we did not go in to vote for a bond issue to get our 20% state money to match our 80% federal money to do road projects. It made no sense borrowing 20% and paying interest. No other state did it, I believe.
Right.
And for the first time, working together, that's infrastructure, that's interest that we can now put to where it should be going, to roads and bridges and dams and fiber optics and all the good things we can do. Transportation, probably not fiber optics, but, and then workforce development. We're building the economy the right way, and the metrics are showing that we're doing it the right way.
Okay. How do the two of you feel? Is the Rhode Island economy heading in the right direction?
I absolutely believe that we are. We've did historic income tax reform over the past 2 years. We've funded education and finally resolved the issue of an education funding formula. In the area of infrastructure, we've also created a transportation fund that
We've got work to do.
finance
We're going in the right
committees are
direction.
continuing to look at. But we've made very difficult decisions. These past couple of years have not been easy years to be in the General Assembly. The choices have been hard. We also faced a lot of the things that other states face, but we're almost at a county level. We're almost the same size as a lot of counties are. And sometimes on these surveys, particularly in the area of taxes, that doesn't show up. I don't think that we're being compared sometimes to states far larger than ours. That being said, we share some of the problems of the larger states, such as the loss of revenue to internet sales. which has desperately, which has changed, which has created difficulties for all of our small businesses, our
That passed
bricks and
nationally.
mortars business, and all three of us have really advocated for the Main Street Fairness Act, of which Sheldon Whitehouse is a co-sponsor. Those are things that every state faces. Yet, when you get to the image issue, there were times when I know that you've never heard, even no matter how difficult things were in Texas, anybody from Texas ever say anything but the great state of Texas.
Mhm.
I do believe that we as leaders in Rhode Island, and the business community as leaders, and the nonprofit leadership need to become the best salespeople for our state. We do need to begin to talk about the good things that are going on in Rhode Island if we're going to continue to move forward.
Mhm. Okay.
Well, I'll add also on that, one of the indicators that we're going in the right direction is the confidence the voters showed in November on improving the bond issues. I've been around when you don't have a lot of confidence in the decision-making, the investing ability of those in government, and bond issues don't pass. These five correct, were on the ballot, were overwhelmingly approved. That's, in this tough economy with high unemployment, people are saying we're going in the right direction, we're going to invest in these bond issues, and they were all approved remarkably high percentages, I thought, in this economy.
You said
That
something,
shows confidence.
Teresa, about, we as leaders need to do a better job selling Rhode Island. And the thing that we heard repeatedly through every sector throughout this year in Reinvent Rhode Island and the public occurrences forums, and you brought it up today, is vision or lack thereof. You've all been, in your seats for a little while or a longer while. Where has that vision been? Why don't we have a vision?
I heard that. I take issue with it.
And I would ask your opinion on that. And then I would ask you to articulate the vision. But
Well, I think the vision's been there. I think what and some of it because is in terms of what the governor and the Senate President had just talked about, in terms of it takes visions to know that you have to get an education funding formula passed. Didn't happen for a lot of years, but it took vision to say, you know what, our public schools are so important to the success of this community that we need to get a predictable way to fund public schools, that we have to add an incentive to have families feel they can send their children to public schools. That's vision. I mean, a lot of times what people don't realize is connecting that, because we feel we feel our own pain, and things may not feel well, you don't feel like you're moving ahead in your job or whatever, just start to think that we're heading in the wrong direction. But a lot of this stuff is nuanced, and it does take time. The very mere fact that we decide as leadership we have to live within our means. We tackle things like, and it's in the courts now, pension reform, or the fact that you had to make tough cuts, tough human service cuts over the last few years to say we have to show the world that we can live within our means. An opening budget surplus not only shows good revenues and things like I think shows sign of confidence, but it's also because we were making the tough cuts. I think that we have had leaders over the last few years. I'd like to include Senate President Paiva Weed, Governor Chafee, myself, and that we have said on our watch we can't kick these strong issues that had been kicked down the road for a long time. We have to tackle them. We can't keep bonding for infrastructure. We have to find a way to better that we pay as we go, because it makes better sense, brings down our bonded indebtedness, the things that all the experts and gurus look at, but also the things I think shows confidence to the person on the street that we are tackling those issues that government should be tackling, that we are hoping that set the conditions for long-term growth in the state. We're just beginning with this, and it's not going to happen overnight. So when I got beat up a little bit at public occurrences when I was saying it was like we want to fix tomorrow. If that's the fix you want tomorrow, it's probably going to lead you to a bad result, because even in that room of 150, 200 people, they probably had 200 ideas of where they thought we should be going. So, but within that, within the confines of government, you make consensus, but you constantly move the ball forward. One of the things, I'll go back to one of those reports, CNBC report, that I think is a good indicator. They showed Rhode Island has moved from 35th place in the top 10 on attracting venture capital. That's people looking at Rhode Island saying, I'm going to invest in Rhode Island. I think that's a positive. So I think when we show that part of that is, all of that is part of this vision, but I think we need to find a better way to put it all together, whether it's in a plan with somebody, whether it's the governor or a secretary or an economic development director, whatever we're going to call it, person who's our elected leader, our appointed leader, with this plan so that we can show Rhode Islanders, you may not necessarily feel like there's a plan or that this is going to improve your lot in life. But I'm going to tell you, when I went out campaigning, the very fact that warmed my heart, how many people on the east side were telling me they were sending their children to public school, who long ago would have been thinking, I can't send my child to Nathan Bishop or Martin Luther King or Martin Gregorian, so I've got to also shoulder the burden, which I consider a tax, of having, not by choice, but by means of getting a good education, putting my kid in a private or parochial school. The very fact that we're turning things around like that, to me, is part of a long-term plan, which I believe are going to pay dividends economically in society as we go forward.
Is it that turnaround, or is it that they can't afford the private school?
No, I think there is a turnaround, because I think even a parent, because I've got brothers, I've got 20-something nieces and nephews, and I've had brothers and sisters that couldn't afford necessarily to go to parochial school, but felt you can't hit a reset button on your child's education, so felt the need compelled years ago. But now they're looking at public schools saying, my Johnny, my Jane can succeed in that program because people like us have cared enough to do education funding formulas to make sure that we're fighting to make sure the curriculum are going to send them someplace further in their lives. Now, we need to do better with that. We need to, as you get to workforce training, as we're dealing with cohorts of people that have literacy problems that didn't get what they needed in the public schools. That's what we're dealing with, and that's when you show 44% of our workers over 25 only have a high school diploma. We've got cohorts of people that, long before we got here, did not get what I believe they needed to do to have opportunities in life to move in different careers and succeed in life. We're tackling that. We need to look forward, and I think the Governor's Workforce Board is doing a great job. The stuff that the Senate and Teresa and the House have been advocating for, and making sure we invest in adult literacy, we invest in workforce development to deal with the problems of the past while we have to continue moving forward. It's a big ship of state. And turning around practices don't happen overnight, but it is going in the right direction, I believe.
I would add to that. I think I agree with everything the speaker said. That being said, I described a consensus plan. And that is a plan in which it's not just the governor having a plan or the speaker and the Senate president having a plan, but a plan that's a vision, a written document that comes based upon participation from the community and buy-in from the community, the business community. So we set forth, for example, to kind of echo what the speaker said, we really have been acting out a plan. We enacted under the leadership of Leader Ruggiero and Speaker Fox, I-195, the Knowledge District. We've said this is important to us. We've got Ray Gallison, myself, others who focus on the defense industry. We definitely, in the governor's office, they've already mentioned electric boat. We've worked with our federal delegation as well as Raytheon. We have the sectors. We know defense, we know tourism, but I'm talking about sectors of economic development. And what I'm talking about is the defense industry, the tourism industry, the knowledge district. And those sectors all coming together. And I would add to that, as part of the vision, or would ask people to consider the arts as well. Yes. And that's something I would hope to champion. What we need to do now, though, is reach out to those private businesses. And so they're not at the State House just lobbying for their little niche. So the marine industry isn't just up at the State House lobbying to preserve the boat sales tax repeal, which is a good example of an economics incentive specific to an industry who does report on how many jobs they create, and we can see how positive they've been. But they're up there talking about the whole tourism industry, and that we're working off the same sheet of music. So when we look at the corporate tax rate, we have everybody in the room who has a stake in that saying it's better for the state to reduce a corporate tax rate than for each company to have a specific incentive. So what I'm referring to is a consensus plan, not a plan that government imposes upon the private sector, rather a plan that's developed working together with the not-for-profit sector, the universities, the David Dooleys, the Rhode Island Foundations, the RIPECs, and the Chambers of Commerce as well. And that's the plan I'm talking about, with buy-in from the private sector, participation from the not-for-profit sector, and leadership from the three of us, quite frankly.
I just want to vigorously say that there's a strong vision from the governor's office. I wouldn't have run for governor if I didn't have a vision for where I want Rhode Island to be. And I've repeated it over and over again, and that's to what I call, since it's football season again, block and tackling. When your team's not doing well, you go back to basics. And that's what I believe in. And people say, oh, there's no vision because it's not flashy. There's not the fancy Hail Mary. There's not the Statue of Liberty play. We're just grinding it out, blocking and tackling. And
well, you talk about
once again, the metrics
infrastructure,
yes,
education,
yes, and workforce development.
Workforce development.
Yes, that's the blocking and tackling of growing a foundation so that we can say to the businesses 10, 15, 20 years from now, we're going to give you predictability. We're going to give you stability. We're going to give you certainty. That's what they want.
I guess I like to throw
They'll
the ball.
gladly pay the taxes.
You have to throw the ball a little every now and again.
He's blocking and tackling, but I like to throw the ball a little, so that's...
Well, how would you like to throw the ball in a way that...
That's when I say we've got to look at our tax structure, we've got to take some bold moves, we've got to look at public-private partnerships like Dave Dooley. And yes, there's going to be some risk in these things that we're going to do.
Do you agree
but
with that?
we need
Historic
to...
tax
I'm going to
We need
read
to
something
balance
from
that
the New York
against-
Times, if you'll let me. It's just a week ago.
I read it.
And this is, and the Journal also covered this when I was running for office, and there was a report which I also brought from Perry, and the Journal covered this, did a good story on it, saying that we're better off investing in education and infrastructure,
I agree
workforce
with that, Governor.
development. That's what pays off. And I'll just read if you'll let me, it's quick. Competition among states and cities to lure businesses in hopes of creating jobs is not new, but has become more fierce in recent years. Investigation by the Times found that state and local governments that are giving out $80 billion a year in tax breaks and other subsidies in a foolhardy, short-sighted race to attract companies. That money could go a long way to improving education, transportation, and other public services that would have a far better shot at promoting real economic growth. One more paragraph. The trouble with targeted incentives is that they are little more than transfers of wealth to a handful of powerful corporations from all other taxpayers, including other businesses. If the problem is excessive tax burdens on businesses in general, then the solution is broad tax reform that also benefits small business owners.
We're saying the
This
same
is the most
thing.
important thing. The last sentence. The small business owners who are more likely to stick around if the regional economy weakens and who are unlikely to hopscotch around the country in search of a bigger tax break. That's what I've been saying.
Well, talk to each
We're
other. I don't
talking-
think
we're
you're-
both saying the
you're-
same
yeah,
thing.
But when you say you want to do something bold as well as focusing
broad-based
on the
tax
not so
reform.
sexy things, what are you referring to?
I'm referring to the income tax reform we did,
Okay.
looking at broad-based tax reform, in addition to just infrastructure and education. I'm talking about taking some initiatives as well as building our education, which we've demonstrated our support for that by the additional funding we've put in the last two budgets, and infrastructure, as we've already discussed. Those are two important building blocks. We're 100% together. I am not advocating for special incentives. In fact, as the author of the legislation, the sponsor of the legislation with regard to tax expenditures, I'm very concerned about special tax incentives.
I didn't
But I
mean
do
to-
support broad-based
No,
tax
right.
reform, as the governor.
And I think they're
Through a bold
agreeing,
move
but I
as
think
tax incentive.
exactly.
I just meant, what are there other things we haven't talked about that you would consider a bold move, that like a pass that needs to be thrown in addition to the infrastructure and education and workforce emphasis?
Let me give that some thought. There are some things that I would say, that I've thought of. One in particular I would mention is adding arts to our cluster. I believe we have some of the foundation there, but we don't have a comprehensive picture for arts as an economic development tool. We have the film tax credits, we have money that goes from the Rhode Island Arts Council, and we have a lot of districts that have art districts, but they're kind of scattered throughout the state, and there's one in Westerly, one in Pawtucket, one in Providence, one in Newport. They're all over the place. And last year, I think the speaker and I and our finance chairs became frustrated because more and more communities are coming forward. And one of the things that I would like to look at, and I've asked my staff already to look at, is a charrette of sorts that would bring all of the participants in the arts together, the film people, the museum people, the artists, and take a look at all the tax incentives that we're offering for the arts and package them as an economic development sector, because that is one area, creative industries, that we have had job growth over the past 2 years. So if I was going to say kind of a new idea that I think is something we can look at, I would not support a broad-based income tax exemption for all over the state for the arts, but I would like to look at the possibility on the sales tax piece, only because it seems to me we're almost there. When you look at Providence and Newport, it's difficult for me to believe.
You mean exempting the sales tax?
The sales tax for the arts.
Which is done in certain districts.
Make ourselves, do something unique and bold to market ourselves as a state for the arts. That's the kind of idea, and it may or may not work, but those are the kind of ideas that I think we need to look at and bring in the not-for-profit sector, bring in the business sector. We have a company, Fidelity's been mentioned a couple times here. They are huge supporters of the Rhode Island arts. We have the Rhode Island School of Design right in downtown Providence. We have all of the building blocks to develop a coherent economic sector of the arts and be known not just in New England but nationally as a place where artists want to come and work and do business.
What do you think of that idea?
It's a good idea, absolutely. It's a sector that we have a natural advantage on, creative people. And I'll add this in there. So good to hear this morning of the Senate. It might look favorably on marriage equality. It's important to growing this sector. It's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. Tolerance, technology, and talent, the 3 T's. And tolerance is a big factor, especially in this area. And you have to make the connection. Not only is it a civil rights issue, which I'm glad we talk about, but also the economic advantage of marriage equality. I hope that passes this year. It's important to this sector of the economy.
I know that your personal views are clear, and what you said the other day about not standing in the way of a vote on gay marriage is now clear as well. Do you see an economic advantage to a gay marriage bill in terms of, again, Rhode Island's image?
I wouldn't argue one way or the other. I don't know enough. I mean, certainly there is a viable argument to be made by those that advocate in support of marriage equality that it would attract people here.
Absolutely.
However, I would suggest to you that that's not the reason that people are going to vote for or against
I understand
this
that, but since our
legislation. It's a
focus
much
today
more
is
serious
economics,
issue
yeah.
and personal issue to members and to the community than that.
How do you feel about that, Gordon? Just, I know how you feel personally, but from an economic standpoint.
Well, I think you just look at examples. I think there are, in Texas, which is not a bastion of liberalism, but then you look within Austin, which is a tolerant place and seems to economically be a juggernaut. And you look at Cambridge, Massachusetts, you look at other places that we know good, thriving urban communities and places. And tolerance is a big part of the equation, as well as good infrastructure and transportation and great schools of higher education. So it's one of those factors I look at, and it can't hurt, can it?
How is tolerance part of the equation? How
I
does
think
that translate
because
to
it
economics?
attracts, remember, Rhode Island, we've got a dual problem, is attracting but retaining. And we have some great schools of higher education, but people have to go somewhere else to make it. And I think people want to live, and they'll find a reason to stay and maybe take a lesser salary or work harder to get the career of their choice if they know it's an accepting, tolerant place. So when you're looking at talent, and I agree with the governor, tolerance, technology, and talent, I wrote it down. I kind of like that. I think it does add value.
Fellow named Richard Florida.
It does add value.
Stole
I
it.
think when you look at educated, enlightened places, tolerance has to be part of that. And shouldn't that be part of Rhode Island's equation? It all started under a tolerant theory.
It all started under what?
A tolerant theory.
Yeah, that's right. I'm sorry, where did that phrase come from, Governor?
Richard Florida wrote a book
I like that.
about 3 T's and how to grow an economy.
Okay. Have you used that phrase before?
Oh, yeah.
I seem
Yes.
to.
I've heard you now.
What about, okay, now you sit here and you say, I do have a vision, it may not be sexy, but it's the steak, not the sizzle. But is the public getting that? When you just read you a few quotes, the RIPEC report, and we'll talk about that later, about the recommendations. The RIPEC, Rhode Island does not have a clear vision of how to expand its economy. Saul Kaplan, a former EDC director, the thing that's missing through our whole economic development conversation is a clear message We need leadership to create that vision. You know, Gary Sass, the director of Bryant's Institute for Public Leadership, the governor is not connecting the dots on an economic development strategy. And I understand you disagree with them, but if enough people are saying that, is your message getting out, or do you need to do something else or different to communicate that?
Well, I don't want to minimize what people are saying, but these are talking heads. I'd like to think that the public voted on the bond issues to show confidence. To me, that I saw those results, I was frankly stunned. In this tough economy, I think that's a statement of endorsement of the path we're on. People like it. It's steady, and it's not flashy. So the talking heads are all, I'm saying, wringing their hands, but I think the people have spoken and voted by saying this is what we endorse. And not only is it the unemployment going in the right direction with those 5 indicators, but also our revenues. We're doing something right in this state when we look at sales tax and income tax exceeding budgeted amounts. That's another mark of confidence. People out there spending, they're not hoarding and hunkering down, and that's sales tax revenue. And then income tax, obviously, is people either getting raises or getting jobs or getting hired more. That's our income tax revenue coming in right off more income, people making more money. So these are positive, and communication's always a part of any effort, and always trying to improve in that area to make sure the talking heads aren't falling into the Eeyore trap of negativity towards Rhode Island.
You said earlier, you said that you think we as leaders collectively need to do a better job of selling Rhode Island. How do you feel about what the people have said about the governor's failure to articulate a vision versus what the governor's saying in response?
I think that when we ask people to take a look at us and tell us what we can do better, and I'm not going to single out the governor, I'll say all of us in government.
And media.
And that we often hear that we don't communicate as well or as often or as frequently to the public. I believe that the speaker and I, on the legislative level, have recognized that a little bit in trying to show more committee meetings to the public, for example.
Right.
On a personal level, as I knocked on doors and was out in the community campaigning, and I will say about the bond issues, while the executive branch wasn't up for election this time, we had 38 and they had 75 that were. We're out there doing newsletters, doing mailings, telling people what we did for that 3 to 5 month election cycle. And we're out there almost every day saying to people, well, we passed pension reform. We did income tax reform. We're looking at historic tax credits going forward. We did an education funding formula for the first time. We've invested in roads and infrastructure. So you had an entire General Assembly out there telling the public all over the state all the good things that were going on. And so that energy level right after elections tends to fall a little bit. And I would say at the national level it does too. I look at the talking heads, as the governor referred to them, and say I'll take that as constructive criticism that we need to continue to ramp up and improve our communications to the public. I go to Newport, for example. I talk to them about what's going on at Quonset. I talk about Charay. I talk about electric vote. They know a little more about electric vote. I talk about job lot. And I talk about all the development. Some of them have no idea that's going on. You go to Pawtucket, they have no idea of how big the defense industry is in Newport. We need to really take time, and that's where the vision, the plan, the written document that says, these are the clusters, these are the areas we're going to develop. We need to communicate that to the public better, because you can always do it better. And I would say at the national level, when Bill Clinton came here and spoke about Obama, he said one of the things that he needed to do better was talk.
Right.
A couple of years ago, it really struck me to brag about all the good things they had done.
Right.
We don't sometimes get that out. So I'm going to say that my response is I think we can all do a better job of communicating to the public One of the things I took away from the RIPAC analysis is improved transparency. It is our intention to work on legislative initiatives that will improve transparency. And in and of itself, the more transparent we are, the more people know what we're doing, the more confidence they're going to have in what we're doing. They're not always going to agree with what we're doing, but if they know what we're doing, we'll move forward. So I think we can do better, and I'm committed to doing better, is what I would say.
Okay.
Not just at election time, but all year round, getting that word out.
Since you, did you want to wait?
No, I think communication is key, and to take off on the transparency in terms of what we've done the last 2 years. I mean, having real-time view of the votes as they take on the floor, moving towards online votes in the committees, putting Wi-Fi in the building. After all these years, it was never, who would have thought that? Because I think people won't agree, but at least if they have an idea where their particular in our case, where the representative or senator is voting, hopefully they'll see that, okay, I can see where they're going, I understand how they're voting, and maybe it'll remind them, because when they're asking those questions, I'm sure not thinking about, oh, but they passed an Office of Regulatory Reform, and they're going to review 260 regulations. They're not thinking that. But all of that has to be better communicated, and it is working towards a goal. I mean, one thing that Quonset dredging, for instance, coming up with a plan not to go to the Corps of Engineers like most people, like, why aren't they using the Corps of Engineers? Where our Port Commission, Joint Port Commission, realized if we had done that, they would have imposed a value added on it, which would have, a tariff on that, would have taken away a premium of why that port is successful vis-a-vis other Northeast ports. So we came up with a way through there to come up with a way, with the executive right at the side, to come up with a way to do revenue bonding, to have the people that use it, but ultimately leading to a better goal of having more jobs available at Quonset, because you dread something not sexy, not something I'm sure is on the top of their mind when they ask them, do you think Rhode Island's heading in the best direction, that we're removing silt off the coast of North Kingstown? But it adds value, and I think those type of things, whether it's it's put into a plan and people see it and vet it and see it constantly, but as we do better communication to remind them that we want to be transparent, we want to have you're welcome to be included in the discussion in how we devise this whole stakeholder idea, but ultimately decisions will be made, and those decisions will hopefully lead us in the right direction. I think that's important.
Okay. Well, you mentioned RIPEC. I wanted to talk about RIPEC and start with you, Governor. You had asked RIPEC to take a hard look at the EDC, the Economic Development Corporation, which over the years has been the subject of many studies, many complaints, that it's ineffective. It made a number of recommendations, principally, I suppose, that a major restructuring of the state government to accommodate economic development, create a commerce secretary to signal the high priority of economic development, bring together some of the different government agencies. What do you now see as changes that you may propose or plan to propose in 2013, either legislatively or through executive order?
Well, the biggest issue for me coming in as governor is inheriting a board and an executive director in which, as we moved forward, we found we really didn't share the same philosophies, particularly on what I just talked about from the New York Times editorial and some of the incentives. I want to be much more conservative on that. We had different directions we were going. It was very, very difficult. So I asked RIPEC to see if they could find a better way to sync up the governor's office and this entity, which I would argue is the most important, as mayor, the most important department for me as mayor was economic development. It's no different as governor. This is the most important department. We have to be in sync and share the same philosophy, which I ran on. No surprise, that's what I ran on. And so that's what I asked them to do. It turned into a much bigger recommendation. And subsequently, I did meet with business leaders and RIPEC directors, and Bob DiMuccio, who was president of the RIPEC board. He really was strong about following through on having someone at EDC in close relationship with the governor's office. And so we've done that today. We're announcing today, just by coincidence, that John Pagliarini is going to join EDC and really be that director that liaison that Bob DiMuccio talked about, that RIPEC recommended. So following through on it, it was controversial in the RIPEC recommendations, especially with DEM coming under a commerce secretary. There were some controversial parts of their recommendations. And I'd just like to see in the future for future governors that not happen to future governors what happened to me, is in that first year, really not having the chemistry you need in this most important department. And I'll also just add that I do believe as mayor and as governor, the governor should be really the economic development director, and I back that up by going to Houston, going to Baltimore, going to Pittsburgh, going to JetBlue, down in Queens, New York, going to Paris, France. That's what I see as the job of governor, is really intimately involved in economic development.
Is it sufficient in your mind to just get people in sync with you at EDC and not follow through with some of the RIPEC recommendations, such as establishing a commerce secretary and bringing some of these agencies together, maybe not DEM, but to coordinate and streamline?
Yes, good question. Right now it's working well. I do have a feeling right now it's going smoothly, and we've got a good grip on our loan programs and our customer service, so critical. There's nothing more important than tending your garden at home. I think we're on the right path. I don't foresee, I don't know what the legislature has in mind, but if we could just fix that so future governors don't get hamstrung by having lack of chemistry in this important department. Other than that, I think we're going the right path. Anything changes, I'll certainly be
Well,
open
let's
to
hear what the
legislation.
legislature has in mind. Mr. Sheep.
Well, I think I want to record that. I mean, in terms of the RIPEC report as a foundation for a discussion, I think is important. And what I extrapolate from there, and I think both myself and Teresa have talked about that today, is a consensus-driven plan. I think it's what is the best vehicle to make sure you allow for the consensus to develop, that you have a plan. And I'm open to what that process looks like, but I think we need there, and we need to get there. I think accountability, transparency, an analysis of business needs, I mean, as part of that plan, the report that came out. I think that's a very important function, and I'm not sure sitting here, Speaker of the House, that that's happening right now. So I'm looking at it, what is the proper structure in order to maximize the process to get to where we need to go, because process is important. And it shouldn't be where it's one-offs. It should be where it accounts for basis of our government. Every 4 years you have different chief executives. Every 2 years you have different legislatures. So you take that into account. But it's how do you keep moving forward, always asking what's in business's best interest and what is government's appropriate role in making sure we have a healthy business climate.
So should we have a commerce department? Is the RIPEC
I mean,
report?
I don't know if we're going to call it, but I like the idea, and I've stated it publicly, of the idea of talking about commerce, because it takes more into account than job creation. It takes into account what's your education policy, because that's part of commerce. What's your tax policy, because that's a part of commerce. What's your transportation policy? What are you putting into transportation and infrastructure development? That's a part of commerce, as well as regulation. So we've dealt with those legislatively and with governors over the years in terms of silos. But is there a process, is there ability to look at those to maximize, again, when you should do incentive programs, when is a policy working, when is it not working, when does it comport with where our plan should be going, again, a plan that's decided and driven by consensus. So I think whatever that looks like, I want that to happen.
Madam President, what do you think?
Yeah, I really like the part of the report that Gordon referred to, which talks about reorganizing for transparency and accountability. And I would like to see the executive branch, once again, the governor has been, is, and as far as I know will be, continue to be the chair of the EDC. He controls that board, he controls the oversight function. The General Assembly is somewhat removed, quite frankly, very removed. Years ago, we were much more involved, pre-separation of powers.
Right.
I think that post-separation of powers, we immediately came off all the boards of commissions. But I know the speaker said this, and I've said this. One of the visions I have is to improve oversight. We have an oversight committee, but it's my intention this year to amend our rules and include an oversight function in each of the standing committees so that it's modeled more like Washington. House Finance does that now very well, and Senate Finance to a somewhat lesser degree, but they do it as well. We've seen it in our Health Committee. They bring in DCYF. But our other committees have not been doing that. Our Corporations Committee, which truly should be our commerce committees, probably could be bringing in the EDC folks and holding them accountable and having more hearings, much like you see in Washington. Something goes wrong, the Public Works Committee or the Armed Services Committee brings those folks in. The quasis are problematic in that there is a lack of accountability right now between them and the General Assembly. The Speaker and I, because they don't come to us, the Airport Corporation doesn't come with the budget to the General Assembly, they're out there somewhere. We don't know what's going on with the Airport Corporation unless there's a problem. Then we know what's going on with the Airport Corporation. We don't know what's going on with some of these agencies unless we specifically bring them in. So that portion of the RIPEC report, which states that there needs to be more transparency and accountability in the Economic Development Corporation, I'm 100% supportive of. How we do that, I'm willing to work with the Speaker and the Governor to figure out how we do that. I also think the vision is important. It's not a vision, as I said before, that comes from the Governor and is imposed upon business. It's a consensus document. It's a plan that everyone buys into, that there's give and take and we agree and disagree. Yes, tax incentives aren't a good thing or special plans, but you mentioned Torrey. We actually did some special things with renewable energy money to make sure that Torrey could, in fact, stay here and expand so we could compete because they're a good Rhode Island business. Is that a special deal? Is that a special tax incentive? Well, if it is, then that was the right thing to do, in my belief. An investment tax credit might be appropriate in certain instances with certain companies, but they need to be transparent and accountable, and business has to buy into it. It can't come from us. We're General Assembly members. We need to have business. The other part of the RIPEC report, which is mentioned, where I anticipate there would be legislative discussion in both the House and the Senate, since I think we both have members talking about it, is a research arm. Now, whether that's an economic policy advisor board, whether that's within EDC, I'm not sure how that takes form, but we do need to have more research done and data collected and more factual information upon which all the decisions we reached are based, and hopefully based upon recommendations that are given to us from the outside. So those are the things that I think were really important. And the final thing, of course, I've already indicated the General Assembly is working with RIPEC on analyzing the factors that affect the economic climate, the business climate, and addressing those factors head on, two of which the Governor has said very clearly, infrastructure improvement and education, which I think there's agreement among all three of us that we need to do.
So I'm getting a sense that you're talking generally about consensus. You like the idea of reorganization. The Governor feels things are okay now with EDC.
Yes,
structurally. So where does this leave us? Are you going to talk to the Governor? Are you going to propose legislation
I think
in the next session to try
we're
to
talking
create?
tomorrow, I
Right.
think.
I think so.
We're meeting tomorrow.
First time? Has it come up amongst you?
Well, the
before?
oversight issue, both the Speaker and I, that's a legislative
Right,
function.
exactly.
That's our legislative
Well, I meant
function.
more on this recommendation about creating.
Yes, I just add a caution. I know this is down the road, but customer service is so important. That's one area that EDC really got beat on, not getting back to people.
Oh,
And we've got
absolutely,
that
right.
working well. If you go into such a massive shakeup, a spider web of new organization, I'd hate to blunt the good work we've done on customer service. That would be a big fear of mine, is any kind of massive shakeup and reorganization. I call it a spider web in some of the recommendations, all different departments. This is very, very critical to homegrown businesses that are here, that getting back to them, big and small. So we'll have good discussions about what can be improved on.
yeah, I'm sure.
Feel free, discuss. Well, no, seriously. You can
And
talk
also
about it now,
say
but
that
what
we won a $1.9 million federal grant to do a sustainable communities grant, and that is bringing in all these departments. We're doing that now, and I've got to share with you the work that Kevin Flynn and statewide planning is doing. We're reaching out to housing and to energy and to EDC and putting together that document with data. That is happening.
And statewide planning may be the exact entity to create the statewide
Yes.
vision plan.
Yes.
That may be the right mechanism. But I think that it needs to be created, it needs to be reduced to writing, it
It's
needs
exactly
to be
what
vetted
you've
with
been
the
talking
public.
about, and it is happening. We've
I
got to
think
get
one of the-
everybody together and make
one
sure
of
you know what the great work they're doing.
Yeah, one of the things I think shocks people is when they read the RIPEC report and it recommends data-driven research and analysis, that hasn't existed.
It's happening now.
Yeah.
with this $1.9 million Sustainable Communities Grant. They're doing great work. It's a lot of money.
And that's very important, and that's why I mentioned it, because it struck me as an important part of the RIPEC report.
So how do you, in your mind, you hear what the governor's saying, that they've made improvements at the EDC, it's working well, let's not create a spider web, we've won here. So how do you balance that with your being intrigued by what the report says about creating this commerce department?
I mean, I'll defer to the speaker, but I think, for example, what he just said, if statewide planning is doing some work, that may be the mechanism by which we get the research and data. I think that the two ideas are consistent, but then I'll go back to what the last question was, and then I'll defer to communication, communicating that to the business community so they know what's going on, communicating it to the General Assembly so they know what's going on. That's very, very important.
They gave a presentation last night to the EDC board, so we're getting out there doing exactly that.
Who did?
Kevin Flynn, and what's going on with this Sustainable Communities Grant, the work they're doing.
What about?
And the board were all enthusiastic about the data collection and the collaborative approach to putting together this plan. And so I do want to get out. You're absolutely right. The President said was absolutely right. We've got to get out on the road with this. And it was my initiative that got them to the EDC board. You've got to inform what's going on. This is good stuff.
Have you gotten feedback from the business community about what they want you to do with the EDC? Any of you? All of you?
Well, one thing I hear, and we heard from public occurrences, is, and maybe that goes to customer service, some of it's the basic, just have someone talk to us, come visit us. And that doesn't take reform of process. That means that someone just gets down there and kicks a little butt and says, get out there, get out of those desks, and go out there and start talking to people. You got a state the size of a county. So some of this doesn't need grand reform. If we got the people there, but those people have to be armed and supported, that people have their back, and that they can go out there with right products and the right answers, so you don't have, just because you're contacting someone, you may do more harm than good. So again, that's where the process, that's where the vision comes in, so that everybody, just like a regiment, is marching to the same beat in the same direction. Because I think that there are a lot of things like statewide planning or whatever have been good stuff, but my feeling has been, in terms of economic development in other areas, if they're all scattered, A, nobody's going to believe you really got a plan or you're really doing anything for their benefit, but B, it's probably going to lead to a worse result. So when I look at it in terms of somebody, whether it's the governor, whether it's an entity, whether it's the clerk of a works, that is supported by the boss and has the right ideas and is telling the troops to get out there to do what you have to do, and it's all in the best interest, but it has to come from consensus, do a plan so that everyone believes that it's in their best interest. Otherwise, who's going to believe it's in their best interest? So it's easy to do. It's just going to come down to the fact, how do we put all these pieces together to make sure an EDC is working? Because I went to those public occurrences. If you ask any of those business leaders, they wouldn't think EDC is working on their benefit. In fact, I was at a RIPEC board meeting, and one very vocal member that was on a panel at the public occurrences told me, she said, I get contacted more each week from EDCs in other states than I ever been contacted by my own.
Is that changing?
And that's something that just shows that you've got to get out there and hit the streets.
Okay.
Find out what their needs are. And I think that could be part of the process in building the plan. Hear from the very people that are trying to do it. What is in their way, what stands in their way, or what may actually be helpful to them.
One area that we're strong in is renewable energy, and we have some great things. One thing, for example, the EDC, someone had suggested that was a great idea, is somebody, it's not just customer service in terms of responding when they come to us, but make a list of the 10 highest energy users and make sure that the EDC is reaching out to them and they're taking full advantage of all the programs that are available and the funding that's available to improve their competitiveness as a business by reducing their energy costs. Because we know for a fact, going back to where we began, that when they look at the factors that make us competitive, among them are high energy costs are an issue here. And so to that end, you could have initiative and reach out to those high users about things they could do before they call us with the problem, or before they call us to tell us they're moving someplace where energy doesn't cost
And a lot of that
as
is
much.
just staying connected. And Teresa mentioned it earlier, just before Governor Chafee was in office, when we went through the BRAC, the Basic Reliability and Closure process, where defense industry is so important to Rhode Island, to the point where most Rhode Islanders don't even realize it. But the hub of that is the Navy base in Newark. When we went through the last BRAC process, we formulated a commission to look at it. We found that Rhode Island, vis-a-vis Puget Sound and others, garbage costs and electricity costs were through the charts, which would have probably led to us losing Newark. Easy to fix. Call up National Grid. Can you give them a better electricity rate? Call up the Resource Recovery. And why are you charging a premium to a federal facility? Straighten those out. The Navy added the last go-round. It became the brain center for the Navy in Rhode Island. So a lot of this isn't about grand labyrinth. It's about being connected, understanding, and I think Rhode Island is receiving dividends and will continue because you were communicating. We were going through a federally regulated process, but because we had the right information, the right people, to say 2 small provisions made all the difference. And those are jobs. So it's like, how do you maximize the ability for that to A, occur, but B, had we not touched upon that, we would have been scratching our heads like, oh, they're packing up the Navy base and there they go. What
we worked
happened?
hard on that, everybody collaboratively.
Right, exactly.
We started way in advance of BRAC.
And BRAC started, right, with Synidia, with the defense, the federal, that's right, I'm sorry, you were in the Senate then.
You were in the
He
Senate
was in the
then.
Senate, the governor was in the Senate, but it was Synidia,
Yeah.
the businesses of Southeast New England,
We were
it was the
focused.
federal
Yeah.
delegation, it was the House and Senate leadership, all focus on making sure that we keep the Navy, not because we want to see a lot of white uniforms, they're nice running around, but we knew that jobs are attached to that base.
Right.
Jobs. And those are the decisions. How do you maximize and incent those processes to happen every day? Because it takes every day being diligent so that you're creating a vibrant economy, because it changes.
Most
It
states
changes
lost.
every day.
In BRAC, we gained 500 jobs in this last BRAC. Because of that.
Exactly. I apologize for that. You were then
and
Senator, Chief.
collaboration.
And that was a lot better story than it happened many years ago when
Yes.
all the Newporters
Right.
County
Yeah.
folks were on a train heading to Washington after the fact.
And we formed a team.
So that's what we're getting at, is how, and we'll discuss this, and you see we have some animated discussions, but it's like, how do we create within government, taking all of our ideas, and that's the genius as well as sometimes the problem with our system, is that it has to be a process. It has to have all these ideas, and you have to reach consensus.
The last big area I wanted to touch on is education and workforce development. Everybody seems to agree that that's important, and yet they can't all seem to get on the same page in how to accomplish it. Rhode Island spends very little of its own money on job training, and I understand there's other funds that come in. There's a lot of criticism that there's insufficient follow-through on various reports and recommendations, coordination among the various state agencies involved in job training. There's been some legislative issues. Would you like to talk about that?
Well, I mean, there's 2 bills in particular that I'm hoping that the governor and the speaker will embrace. One actually originated 2 years ago in the House, but kind of got lost in the shuffle, and then we stole it since it didn't pass the House. It was Representative
Not that you would ever do that.
Well, you guys didn't do anything with it, so we stole it. It was a Georgia Works bill, but we changed it a lot. as we
Oh, that's
knew and
true,
improved.
yes.
And we made that particular bill, and we took that and made it back to work Rhode Island legislation.
Right.
And we're hoping that the House and the Senate will both be sponsors this year of that legislation. And in light of the focus and the urgency that we're putting on economic development and workforce development, that this is something that we can move forward on. Specifically, what that bill will do is there's been a lot of discussion about employees that are looking for work and employers that are looking for employees. And some of this could be done even without the bill. Some you could begin to do. But what we want to do is focus on that issue. So with the Back to Work Rhode Island, we would provide job training while people are actually still receiving unemployment compensation for a period of 4 to 6 weeks. The other bill is an enhanced jobs match program, and Rhode Island Foundation has publicly said that they would help with the funding of that, where the employer will enhance the software that the Department of Labor and Training is currently using, and then the employer will be able to go in and find an expanded employee availability pool, and an employee can go into the system and find more employment opportunities. Once again, it's an enhanced software that Rhode Island Foundation, the Senate passed both of these bills last year. Another idea that once again, stolen from other states because we don't create all of the other. But one thing that has come out of these factors in the MSNBC is that we have a lack of people that have degrees. Yet we find that there's a significant number of individuals, and I don't want to say the number without double checking it, that have some college. Right now we have a seamless structure where you go from CCRI to URI or Rhode Island College. It's much more difficult to take your credits that you earn at Rhode Island College if you went for a couple of years, the non-traditional student, and put those back into an associate's degree. You actually have to apply to CCRI, enroll, and take steps. Other states, what they're doing is they're reaching out to people that have gone to their universities and their state colleges who have some or any courses, and they are providing an easy, accessible transfer of credits to combine those into associate's degrees, reaching out to those non-traditional students who have some college and saying, you know, we have night courses available. 2 more courses and you can have an associate's degree. So that discouraged non-traditional student that has X number of credits at RIC or URI, we can then give them some confidence, give them some formalized document recognizing their college, and allow them to move forward in the workplace and allow us to improve on one of the factors that we're constantly being criticized for, which is not having enough associate's degrees. And yet we find, I believe, and I want to double check this for a political fact that I know will be looking at this, but I believe it's about 120,000 people with some or any college. And so those are some of the thoughts.
This is legislation. That would be legislation.
That would be legislation.
Has that ever been introduced?
But I don't know that it has to be. No, this is a new idea.
That's previous to what happened to.
But that's based upon the MSNBC looking at the things that they keep criticizing us for that get us to be 49. And I think the Board of Governors / Board of Education could probably do some of that without legislation. Let me say that. I don't think you would need legislation. Something like that, we'd probably do a resolution to highlight the issue and ask them to do it.
What about the first 2 things that were legislation that died? What happened to those in the House? It sounds like they passed the Senate.
Well, that's true. Work control. We may have passed that at one point, so I'm not going to say what we passed or not passed.
But do you remember this as an issue?
I remember the Georgia Works when she prompted me with it. It is an issue in terms of how do you better connect. But I think in terms of specific piece of legislation, I look broadly, and I think right now, currently, in terms of the Governor's Workforce Board, under the leadership of Connie Howes and Rick Brooks, I think is a dynamic way to have this stuff vetted. Because I think what Teresa was saying, some of this may not even need legislation in terms of how do you connect industry with the needs of young people. And I think them looking at in terms of job retraining, incumbent training, so that you can enhance skills within the company for a better position within it. A focus on youth in terms of Build Rhode Island and other programs. Their report that came out is a very good report, and I want to give kudos to them, the governor, to everyone working with that, because I think within there is, again, getting to the process of where it's dynamic and you're constantly addressing how well is it going. I mean, some of the stuff I've talked about to Connie and to Rick about, just in terms of the connectivity between employers through the Workforce Board is monumental. Because, again, they're the ones that know what they need in their companies. We can stay in that big marble building and decide what we think should be the training skills, but you have to talk to the people. And I think by building and supporting, and I'm committing to investing more money in terms of the Workforce Board and those type of initiatives to create that connectivity and create the opportunity for an ongoing discourse to connect people to better skills to get better jobs.
Can I just add to that one little thing, too? I made a mistake. I guess they just kind of whispered to me that I said MSNBC. I'm supposed to be saying CNBC. I said the wrong thing. And it's 110,000, not 120,000. But I do want to say along these lines, too, of workforce development, one thing the speaker and I together several years ago took a leadership issue on was adult literacy, which is also a very important component of this. And we did, in that year, jointly additional funding for adult literacy.
Because, again, that gets to that whole cohort of people, for whatever reason, did not get the basic skills that they should have gotten in their young years. And you can't train and retrain unless people have basic literacy skills. So it's all building upon each other and making sure that, how do you make sure you identify the problem and maximize the opportunity to correct it? And we do have a whole lot of folks, for whatever reason, in Rhode Island that don't have basic literacy skills, basic training skills to meet this new economy, to attract those high-paying jobs. It's a fact of life.
Speaker talked about the Governor's Workforce Board. That's been in place for a number of years before my coming to office, and they're working hard at making recommendations, and a
Fantastic
budget is
job.
where you reflect your priorities, and so
Yeah.
I would anticipate that those priorities be reflected in the budget I'll submit to
Excellent.
the
How so?
House and the Senate.
They're doing a great job over there.
How so? Can you
Internships
elaborate?
are very successful, particularly internships. You all know in businesses is nothing like having an intern come in and then seeing how he or she performs and shows up and dresses. And so frequently they are retained. They come as an intern and then move up in the ranks. And
So are you saying more funding you'll hopefully propose in your budget next
Yes.
year for internships? through the
for
Workforce Board?
recommendations that the Governor's Workforce Board has made.
Which are,
A variety of things, but the budget will come down in a short few weeks.
okay. Well, education, there's been a lot of talk about using the higher education institutions as drivers, economic engines. Provide research, spin off companies, keep graduates here. And yet at the same time, everyone talks about how the state university system has been starved financially. It's one of the lowest funded, in New England and elsewhere, perhaps. And I know there's only so much money to go around. So how do you address that?
Well,
You make it a priority.
well, depends on where the funding goes, because I'll argue the fact that direct in terms of the way the higher education universities look at their ongoing budgets, would set their tuitions. We've, over the years, not given the money to direct appropriation with general revenue use, if you will. But when you look at the investment in infrastructure, you mean the state through bond issues, so the votes of the goodwill of the people, but where we've allocated state dollars has been huge. If you look at the investments we've made, I have hundreds of millions of dollars. New pharmacy school down at URI, Environmental Biotechnology Center,
Just did 50 million
New
for
Arts
Rick
Center at
this year
Rick,
in
$20 million.
November.
The College of Pharmacy was $75.2 million. The Environmental Biotechnical Center was $59.7 million. A new chemistry building, $65.8 million. New Lippitt Hall, $11 million. Academic buildings, nursing building at Rick, $50 million. So in terms of state money, in terms of infrastructure, we have invested.
Those are the bond issues?
Those are bond issues, which are state dollars. Obviously, those are obligations of the state, and they're paid back
And the
through
Rick
taxpayers.
was also a
50.
bond issue.
All bond issues.
50.
So where we haven't done in terms of, again, with budget shortfalls and whatever, there had been a tendency, we reversed that, as the governor talked about earlier, in terms of direct appropriation to it, because it became, do you put those into social programs and tuitions were a way that past legislatures that I was a part of, it was the budget, put that in, not the right way to go, because we know that the tuition burden, the student loan burden of Rhode Island is above average. So we're trying to stem that. And I think because we've got more revenues coming in, we've got more wiggle room, it's able to do that. I think that all three of us would concur that public higher education is phenomenally, hugely important to the success of the state. I'm a Rick grad.
Are we investing enough in higher education right now?
I don't know if it could ever be enough, but we should always do better. But again, it's got to be in the context of the myriad of needs that are budgeted throughout. And higher education to me is future-oriented. I look at my own life, and I know what Rick did for me and what it's done for my life and my family and future generations. So I extrapolate that, and I would want any kid that found himself to be in the same position that I happen to find myself in, to have a CCRI, a Rhode Island college to go to, but also not only have that college to go to, but have that college offering the finest programs possible in the public higher educational institution system, bar none. And so it has to be quality as well, and I think we are making strides towards that.
And do you two agree that we're investing enough in higher education?
In these tough economic times, absolutely. I mean,
We
because
added
previous
last
budgets, previous administration cut higher ed.
You
And
added.
I put in even with the toughest budget, probably in Rhode Island's history.
It might not be enough, but it's as much as you can do, and you're still digging out of that hole of prior cuts.
Yes, and it's showing a priority, so when times are good, it's going to continue to be a priority, and we're going to continue to require accountability on how the money's spent, but to provide the resources also, as long as I'm governor.
Yeah.
And the speaker talks movingly about going to Rick, but all across the country.
And
all
I would
across
say the
America, we built
infrastructure-
the country, built a middle class by the ability to go to the seaside, go to Rick, and have it affordable. Go to URI across the country, whether it's Missouri or Kansas or Idaho. That's what made America the great country it is. I firmly believe that. And you cannot have these students coming out with crippling student debt. And that's our task.
I would say the only other thing I'd add to this is you can't understate what the speaker said. We've actually had to sign a letter in connection with one of the federal programs that identify the debt service that's in connection with our higher education system. That being said, I would also point out the changing role of CCRI, and that more and more frequently we hear in discussions about education that we really are no longer looking at K through 12, but K through 14. And the growth of the community college and the changing role of the community college as they seek to find a balance and identify their new role in this new world has and will continue to require additional investments both at the state and federal level. Uniquely, Vice President Biden's taken a unique interest in the community colleges,
right.
And there's been federal money that's been made available, and we've also invested at the state level. As we go forward, I believe that you're really going to see significant growth that we're going to need to continue to focus on. And once again, in mention to those bond issues, I want to mention the beautiful campus we have in Newport,
Yeah.
and what a difference that has made for the people of Aquidneck Island in terms of having access to higher education. We're an island with bridges, and it really has made a real difference in terms of affordable education for individuals who live in my community who would not have been able to go to college but for that CCRI being there.
And I would only add with CCRI is what we also have to do in terms of, and I'm glad Teresa mentioned K through 14, because I'm calling it K through lifelong learning, is that we've also seen reports that 2/3, associate's degree is 24 months, 2/3 of that time is spent in remedial education.
Mm-hmm.
That A, economically we're paying for it twice, and B, it's not giving them, time is precious in those 2 years with all sorts of familial needs, and the students that go to CCRI, we have to make sure that there's connectivity and that kids going to CCRI aren't just redoing what they should have already gotten, because
Right.
they should be enhancing their skills there, not getting skills they should have gotten somewhere else.
And we've been talking about public higher education, but we can't forget the Bryants and the Salves and the PCs and the RISDs and the Browns, New England Tech,
True.
Johnson and Wales. What an important part. Have I got them all? I don't want to leave anybody out.
I think you have
Roger
them.
Williams?
Yeah.
If you didn't say Salve, she'd have
I
kicked
said
you.
that.
So you said Salve.
What an important part they are
You got it
to
in
what
there.
we're here talking about this afternoon, and that's the economy. They're all very, very
Yeah,
important.
right.
Every one of those institutions, even the Naval War College, I'll add that one,
Yeah.
to the economy here in Rhode Island. And Brown, for instance, and the vision of an engineering school in the Knowledge District is just
So
going to be
true.
a tremendous catalyst to the economy, I believe. These are entrepreneurs coming out of it, the engineers coming out of this new engineering school. They've had a department for Brown for many, many decades. Now they're moving to an engineering school. They talk about building a new building in the Knowledge District and moving it down there. This is a big, big step. These
And I
are
think we have-
talented people coming out, such as MIT generates and for the Cambridge economy and Boston economy.
And I know-
The
I
state
think-
has a role to play in encouraging how we work that out, make
Right.
sure it happens. I strongly feel
I think
that
the
we have a
governor
role
would
to
echo
play.
this, and I'm going to say it and let him run with it. One of the things all three of us firmly agree is that our hospitals and our institutions of higher education play a critical role as we move forward in our economic development. We haven't talked a lot about healthcare either, as well as the private institutions, but I know that we're all on the same page as far as that goes, and we move forward. And ironically, we've talked so much about the Workforce Development Board. The chair of that board right now is actually a hospital executive who's given Connie House, who's giving
Right.
tremendously of her time. So to that end, I just think it's important to mention
Yes.
a segment of our economy that hasn't really been discussed much, but is
Healthcare.
recognized by all of us.
And I wanted to ask you, brings me to my next question about the nursing school. Proposed URI, RIC partnership, public-private partnership, nursing school. There was money in the budget for it last year, it didn't pass. What are the plans in 2013 for that?
There seems to be a lot of focus on this nursing school, and I just want to make sure that we're making a good decision. I did put it in last year's budget. We've heard from other institutions that have nursing programs that have some questions about it. Why this focus on this nursing school? Is that some kind of a panacea? I just want to make sure we're asking good questions before we move forward. That's my own feeling about this. And having heard from some of those institutions that do have nursing schools and their concerns about it, and the government's role to play here, just make sure we're making.
Well, what's
some
your
smart
concern
decisions.
or question about it?
Well, the investment. What is the investment? What's it going to generate for economic activity for the state side? And I just want to be very conservative about anytime somebody gets so focused on what I say call a panacea, to ask the right questions.
What's the right question? Basically, how much is
The
that
economic
generate?
spin-off and the I guess cost-benefit analysis is the cliche phrase.
You went to Houston last year, I believe, and wasn't that to kind of see what you could build in that knowledge district around hospitals, healthcare, a nursing school? Was that part of it?
Yes, they had 3 nursing schools in this one Texas Medical Center, believe it or not.
Well, doesn't that give you confidence that this is a
Yes, but I have heard from, as I have said here this afternoon, from those institutions, how it all works. I don't think that happened in Texas where they were raiding another nursing school. They were willing partners there. So I just want to make sure we're asking the right questions.
Teresa, you said earlier there's times you want to throw the ball. Is this one of those times?
What I have, there's been a lack of a plan, which has been part of the problem. I believe not from the governor, from the institutions.
Right.
The original plan was for bonding, and then it was our understanding that there would be a public-private partnership proposal.
Right.
So really last year, and I've said this publicly and I've said it privately to President Dooley, we were waiting for some kind of legislative proposal that would outline a public-private partnership, and I had told him, we would certainly evaluate that at the time. What I can't support is a full-blown nursing school really in the city, but the idea of a graduate school of nursing is attractive. That being said, I know we've all shared concerns about Rhode Island College and not either graduate school and maybe some of the 3rd or 4th years being in the city. But that, once again, is kind of developed over time. When we went to Baltimore, that's what they had. They didn't have dorms downtown.
Who went to
everybody-
Baltimore? All 3?
All 3 of us,
went down.
yeah. And we looked at
We
that.
toured their nursing school.
Right.
Yeah, and it was graduate. It was
It was a
brand
graduate
new.
nursing school.
And one of the
Right.
things I said at the time is, the speaker just mentioned the pharmacy school, brand new pharmacy school. I said,
Can I tell what you said?
you can tell what I said. I looked at Gordon and said,
What was the plan when they were building the pharmacy school? You're right. Maybe you ought to put it on wheels and roll it up 95.
that's what I said. Because that is really what we saw in the Houston and in Baltimore
Right.
In
was
other
a
words, it should be up here for
concentration
the
of
critical
graduate.
mass.
Right.
So we have a
If you're
new
making a
president and a
critical
new
mass.
focus. And since we're interviewing with the Journal, I think they may have even suggested at the time that the pharmacy school should have been built in the city. I mean, there's something to be said for the graduate schools being in the city because we have the hospitals in the city.
Yeah.
But once again, I'd go back to, we need a real proposal, we need a coordinated plan, we need all of the colleges involved in participating. Brown, clearly, URI, Rhode Island College, on the same.
Is this something that will happen in 2013?
I'm going to wait till I see the plan.
Do you expect it? Do you
If
expect
it
to see
makes
a plan?
sense, I certainly, I want to see the success of the new knowledge district and the health and medical.
Right,
So
and
if
Mike,
it-
I would add, because I think that's what, when Teresa talked about every now and again, you have to be able to throw the pass. The 195 land opened up is
Right.
me throwing the pass. I mean, when you have in your capital city 40+ acres open up under government control, and that is something government can bring to the table. But ultimately, it's like, how do you maximize that? Because it's really not a lot of land, and once you commit to it, it's done. So I think what the governor is saying is that that's a critical piece where the state can bring to the table, and what's the best way to maximize. And we take pressure all the time, especially in Providence, about giving land to nonprofits. It comes off the tax roll. But part of one idea is the nonprofit nature such a generator of jobs that it offsets it and creates a better environment. And why not incentivize an engineering school, or if it makes sense, a nursing school or graduate nursing school? But the numbers have to make sense. The way you go about financing, because I agree with Teresa, they came to us late with, it was originally going to be a bond issue. Then it came to us very late in the cycle saying that, no, we have a new plan. It's going to be a public-private partnership because we'll be able to build it quicker and get private developers in. We didn't really see any of the numbers. And again, with transparency and with the public being a little jaded with some of this stuff, you have to make sure that it's adding the right value, as the governor is saying, but also that the numbers make sense. So as you're throwing that pass, you know you're adding value that's going to add value long term with the use of that scarce, rare government resource.
We all know those construction jobs are good. We know that.
Exactly.
We know that. That's a good
We know
thing.
that.
But after that,
You want the long-term jobs.
Right.
yeah,
Not gonna end
yes,
with it.
yeah, especially as
Building
the
is
speaker said, in this very valuable real estate.
Are you satisfied
Priceless.
with the progress of that 195 track now that it's been created?
You're always wanting it to happen yesterday.
But
Yes.
realistically, are you satisfied with the progress?
My
all
understanding
the way?
is that the utility companies have really stepped up, and
Right.
that it's one of the first times that the utilities have come forward, and actually they're putting them in the ground
Yeah, right.
before the projects are on the table. It's one of those instances where at least it would appear that the private sector is working together with the public sector to
That's
move
grounded
that
work.
project
You're really laying out
forward.
a mini city. So all that stuff about subterranean tunnels and sewers and laying out street grids that no one will, again, back to no one's going to say that makes them feel good about where we're going, but it's a slow, necessary function in order so that when those do nice, what we hope, wonderful buildings full with amenities and people making their lives better, they'll say, wow, isn't that great? But that stuff often happens years before setting the foundation, literally, for that to happen.
I wonder, I know that after the 38 Studios collapse, Governor, I believe you kind of put a hold on further economic development incentives at the EDC for other companies. Have we developed a little 38 Studios itis where maybe we're afraid to
No.
make the worthy
No.
gambles?
No, access to capital's important, and fidelity's been mentioned. There's the right time to get involved in tech. Hasbro downtown.
But are things
That is one of the
loosening
most
up?
exciting things right around the corner from here, giving just a pop to South Square. I drive by there almost daily, as I'm sure you do, and the activity, the construction activity, and then the thought of good paying jobs filling that building, that was a sales tax break, and I'm sure there were other incentives. If it made conservatively and smartly, will pay dividends. And
Is the
so,
EDC
no, there's
making
not
those
a
now, or?
38-itis or whatever you called it.
Yeah. Are there any being made right now? I mean, I know Pat's already mentioned the Fidelity. Those had already been done, I believe, or had already been approved.
There's some small ones. I haven't heard of any lately coming. New Label was one that we did. That was probably prior to 38 Studios collapse. But
Okay.
it depends on who comes
But
forward.
what about
next.
since then? Since the 38 Studios?
We had the company come to Pawtucket. I don't know exactly what they received.
And are you
Expanded
too
the incentive
satisfied
zone
with
in
the progress
Pawtucket.
there? Or do you have concerns that maybe things have dried up too much at the EDC? Or?
I would have to say that we need to do some oversight. One of the things that I would like to take a look at is the entire loan guarantee program. My finance committee, I mean, we've talked about the finance committees need to look at the loan guarantee program and what is known as IRBA, the Industrial Recreation Building Authority loans that are made there.
Yep.
And this goes back to the RIPEC report. And my reference earlier to the fact that the legislature, post-separation of powers, it's been 10 years since that constitutional amendment. We have to figure out how we start keeping a closer eye on the quasi. So as I sit here today, I'm not comfortable saying we're doing a better job or not doing a better job. I think it's time to review those loan programs. The governor certainly did put some protections in place and determine whether or not the benefit to the state outweighs an investment in a different area or not. And that goes back to the RIPEC report where we need research, we need data. to tell us whether or not those programs are working and whether or not we should continue to invest in that way. When we created those programs, banks weren't giving anybody money. Nobody could get loans.
Right.
That's what the times called for. But now there may be a better way to utilize our capital funds, and we'd look to the expertise of individuals who do that type of research and are going to hopefully be in the Economic Development Corporation going forward, and the oversight of our finance committees to evaluate those factual data to make those recommendations going
I want
forward.
to make sure I'm just strong in the answer that, yeah, we're making good decisions at EDCM.
Are you
There's
satisfied?
no
that things are-
equivocation about that.
Yeah.
And it's conservative, but it's smart.
Right. Are you? Are things going well enough there that you don't need the Senate oversight, or do you welcome that?
I'm always welcome.
He's a former senator. He wants oversight.
There you go. All right.
Turn the lights on.
No, and as I've said during my campaign as well, in terms we're doing it in terms of the House oversight function, which full separation of powers never really came into existence. We have oversight committee, not diligent, but all of what Teresa said is absolutely appropriate and necessary, quite frankly. So internally, as we move forward to make it a stronger institution, oversight is critically important to the legislative function, both on the Senate side and the House side.
And we can do it so easily because just the way they do in Washington. I mean, we're not a full-time General Assembly, which makes it a lot harder. But by adding that to a function of our committees, and they're doing a little bit of it now, but I think we can do a better job. And it's not just one committee trying to do everything. You have the committee that has the expertise,
Right.
bringing the issues forward and on a continual basis reviewing. And all the burden isn't placed on the finance committees.
Well, it sounds like you all have a lot of.
A lot to do.
I'm looking at the clock behind
I was
you,
just
and
about to
we're
wrap up.
into
Right.
going on 2 hours, and 38 Studios just came up. So I do think it is important that
I was gonna go another hour.
never
But I won't.
I think
It
I'd
did
go in 6
happen.
months on
A lot of people wish it didn't
Door to
happen,
door.
and a lot of what we talked about here, I do think Governor Kucheri panicked with a bad economy, made some bad decisions, and we just have to make sure that never happens again. It's
I'd like to end on a
everything we're
positive
talking
note.
about, growing the economy, we just can't have these black eyes in this state. And so back to your question about access to capital and some of the philosophy of going forward, we just have to be smart, but also be conservative and think of the taxpayer. We got a black eye with that one. And now we're in a nasty lawsuit and also looking at $100 million. We just can't wish this didn't happen. It did happen.
Okay.
I'd like to end on a positive note and commit to the people that are going to be listening to this on audio, which I just can't believe someone's going to listen to 2 hours of us.
Oh.
But to the
We're
extent
gonna put a
that they,
musical sound.
to the extent that they do, that I think we all realize the urgency of turning Rhode Island around economically, and that we are all committed to working together with each other, with the private sector, with businesses, and the not-for-profit sector, to make the changes that are necessary to move the state forward. We all have an equal responsibility to a state that we all love and call home.
I'd like to end on a positive note also and echo those comments. How many years you been in public service, Gordon?
20.
President?
20.
I get a little over 20, so 60 years of public service here. And I'm sure, as the Senate President said, the reason we run for office is make life better for our constituents.
Exactly.
That's why we're here.
And that's why we're here. And there is a sense of urgency. Never mistake our methods for lack of urgency and
Even if
focus.
you don't always agree on the process.
That's right.
Right.
That's
The
right.
route to get there.
That's
But
right.
we
We
find a
would
way.
run for office
Right.
and go through
Part
these
of running
tough
for these offices,
campaigns.
you know that you have to build consensus,
That's
but
right.
I mean, ultimately, I think people want to feel like the government's on their side. And I know that the two people sitting to my left here are on the people's side. We may disagree on how to get there, but we know that we need healthy communities, we need good schools, we want good jobs. That's what our families depend on. That's what Rhode Island depends on. And we may have different roads to get there, but ultimately, I think we all want to get to that same place where our families feel this is a place that you can live, work, and succeed in life. And Rhode Island is a great place for all of those things, and it can get better, and it has to get better. And I think every one of us being here for over 2 hours is a commitment that we're willing to go on public, on the record, and say we will work together. And you may not always agree with us, but we hope you'll agree that we're trying to work in your best interest. And if we do our job of making it transparent, even though you may not agree, at least you hopefully will understand where we're trying to take the state.
All right. On that note, thanks for your time all.
Thank
Happy
you.
holidays.
Wow, that was not bad.
No, I didn't realize it was 2
That
hours.
was wow.